So in this video, I would like to explore fear. And any background noises, just imagine my lovely sweetheart having a fabulous shower. I've lived with fear my entire life, and it's been a particular kind of fear that it ties in with my body. My lower spine clenches, my legs clench. There's a sense of getting smaller. There's a sense of there not being enough space. There's a feeling of, sometimes a feeling of dread, and it started very early on because, as I've learned later, with early childhood trauma, when it happens repeatedly and no one present understands the biology of trauma, in which you need to run, going from our ancient brain and our ancestral pattern, we need to run, we need to freeze and shake, or we need to fight and attack. And in many social situations, these biological mechanisms are not appropriate. They actually get punished and misunderstood and shamed even further, and shame becomes a new trauma. The bottom line is, when these biological mechanisms are not allowed to run their pace, the trauma message in the biology stays on even after the trauma leaves. And as a result, it's easy to get re-triggered, which is a source of anxiety and fear. And there is a message coming from the body: it's not safe, it's not safe, it's not safe. And this leads the mind to try and imagine and figure out, well, what is the threat? And then there's always a threat. There's always something that could go wrong. Now, for much of my life, I've turned that around by being extra sensitive to possible threats, analyzing what the threats are, analyzing what I could do about them, and then doing a lot of things about them. As a result, my life has seen very rapid progression and movement towards a life with less and less to be afraid of. But partly because the fear never stops. I have a little bit of a rebellious relationship with the fear itself. In other words, a constant message of fear in and of itself becomes a fearful enemy. And when it never lets up, when there's never a sense of peace, I go through periodic phases of rebelling against the fear by pushing into it. And this has mixed results. If it's in a social situation, particularly in a group where I can't explain and articulate it because nobody's interested in hearing or there isn't the space, it can result in, it's called counterphobia. And it's when you do the thing that's scaring you, or you confront or you provoke the thing that's scaring you. And tiny little dogs have this dynamic where they're in so much anxiety and stuff a lot of the time that they face a big dog and then they'll try and attack it. And as in the case of my 4-pound Yorkshire Terrier, that's how she lost her life, was and then going at a big dog and just being bitten in half. And so counterphobia has a mixed success rate, but it does provide a little bit of satisfaction and relief to the oppressive feeling that I'm not doing anything because I'm so scared. Or more particularly, that I'm not doing anything other than what it takes to avoid fear. And this is a certain kind of prison. So I would say that, in areas of my life that where there has been a threat and that required something to be done about it, I'm very proactive and very motivated to do stuff about it. So I'll start, whether it's in my business or this, that, I'm always going out into the future and imagining what could go wrong and what I can do about it, and then doing stuff about it. Now, this is called, in another language, constructive pessimism. And this is something that was also present in Bill Gates. If you read a detailed Microsoft and Gates biography, the impression you'll have is of a maniacal, overworking person who's always driven not only by vision, but also by this could go wrong, we got to do this faster. We're always on the brink. And this has led Microsoft, in part, based on this aspect of Gates' psychology, to keep a very large war chest of cash. I mean, more than most businesses, $30 billion in the bank in many cases. And this is part of that chronic anxiety of who knows, we could be wiped out tomorrow. We got to be safe. And so this is has been my dance with fear. So there's a couple of tools that kind of work with this. So first of all, I want to say that overall, I'm working on that part of it, the PTSD part of it, the bit that's in the biology, because partly in response to the high motivation, I now have a life that is less threatening than most lives that I meet. I'm self-employed, I have savings, I don't have any debt, I have organized lots of redundancies from having some cash in case the bank doesn't, open one day, to, having extra credit cards that I don't use, and just because, and, so there's all these different contingencies. And backup when I need support, like I have chronic fatigue, which has come on as a result of this constant anxiety without relief for 40 years. And so, I'll have an assistant that's there, and it's partly for the periodic few weeks of the year where I find myself flat in my back and I just can't move. And so I want to be able to call someone up and say, well, can you get the groceries this time and do this and do that? And so as I watch different threats emerge in my life, I take note of them. I see where they could go based on the current trajectory. I look at the possible threats as a result of that happening, and then I do stuff about it. So in this, so studies basically show that constructive pessimism is a very high functioning state. And so it has its, pros and cons, but I would say that the internal state is very different from the external state. You'll find Elon Musk talking about the fact that being him is not very fun, and that basically what he does is puts out fires and solves problems, and he's a realist, and so he's goes into things very aware that there's a high probability of failure, which there is. 9 out of 10 businesses go bankrupt within 10 years, and lots of things like that. So the question then becomes, what to do with fear? What have I done that has worked? Now, I've come at it from a couple of different angles. Number one, number one is a high stimulation approach, and that is where I focus on one or two things at a time, and I seek to enter what Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, I'm not saying it right, but there's a book called Flow with an author along those lines, and what it does is it talks about the way you lose yourself, and typically where we lose ourselves is in orgasm, within complete absorption of a problem, trying to be helpful, a problem, within complete physical exertion of some kind, and it can also be complete absorption in a creative project, flow. And so one thing that I have done very consciously is sought to create very high states of flow. Now, the downside of this is it takes me completely outside of the social sphere, because most social interactions, particularly group interactions, do not occur in a state of flow. They're much more of a meandering, peripheral, how about you? No, how about you? And to stay in a state of flow, I've got to be, how about this? Let's do it and let's concentrate. So I do very well one-on-one, in deep interactions one-on-one. Number two, I do very well with goals, and so goals are actually a way to create flow. 5 yearly, quarterly, monthly, weekly, and daily goals reviewed at each of those intervals creates flow. It also doubles and triples accomplishment. So that's one general arena of flow. 2, deep personal relationships, multidimensional relationships, tantric sexuality, deep conversations, healing work, personal growth work, another arena. I've done up to 6 hours of healing and therapy a week in 2-hour bursts, because the first 30 to 45 minutes I've found is warm-up, and then after that I enter a state of flow. More recently, so that's I would say another thing is directing compulsiveness, because compulsiveness, addiction, is partly to manage overwhelming emotion of some kind, in this case fear. And so by choosing my addiction, masturbation is one form of high-intensity addiction that I can control. Number 2 is creative projects. Number 3 is goals. Number 4 is therapy. And what I liked about therapy is there's a chance of working towards well-being in a relative state of flow. And then I engineer the relationship with the therapist in such a way that I can facilitate my flow. So, for example, I might tell some therapists that every time I talk, they interrupt and they create a little narrative, a little anecdote of their own. And I might say, I don't want to hear any of your anecdotes. I want you to just hold space so that I can experience flow, the flow of talking and simultaneously reflecting and analyzing on what I'm saying. But I don't want this little back and forth. I hate interruptions primarily. See, This is where the PTSD agenda of, see, because it's built up in layers. So there's PTSD from a trauma that isn't resolved, that isn't where the chemicals in the body are saying you're in danger of your life. Your mind's looking around, you're saying, no, I'm not in danger of my life. And then your mind's trying to come up with ways that you can feel good even when you're getting the signal on a chronic physical level that you are in danger of your life, but there's nothing to be done about it. And one of those states that is kind of a competitor and competes with this state of chronic fear is flow. Another is that counterphobic aspect of fighting. So sometimes I will not only directly confront, but really push, whether it's a relationship or a conversation or a creative project or someone that's resisting, in order to reestablish flow. I can be quite pushy and bossy in that terrain, where particularly if I'm in a state of flow and that flow is protecting me, see, the flow is creating a shield where I'm not having to feel that chronic background anxiety that is so suffocating. And so when I discover, okay, a goal is good, this is a good goal, and I'm experiencing flow and thus am shielded from that chronic anxiety as long as I'm moving, and then I'm in that path, it's almost an addiction, meaning it's a compulsion to avoid that background anxiety. And then that flow is stopped for what seems like a nonsensical reason. So this is where I'm not a very nice person in this arena for other people, where, and it kind of works like this. So we've got all that part in play. And then let's say there's a really sloppy driver who is not only holding themselves up, but they're holding me up. And they clearly don't know what they're doing. And I see that they don't know what they're doing. I don't have a compassionate reaction to that. I have an impatient reaction. And what the impatient is actually communicating is, Dane, you're in pain. And it's bad, you know, it's at a high level. And this person is just taking away your painkiller. And so I'm responding like an addict. And this is the most dangerous to social relationships, to human courtesy, to human well-being. Because, of course, while on the one hand, I've got a good analytical mind, and I'm fairly competent with my own body. And so it's not that I'm making up that, yes, that's a bad driver in that example. It's that if it were not for the fact that that flow state is shielding me and anesthetizing me to the chronic state of fear, it would not be important. In other words, the goal, I try to pick reasonably intelligent goals, whatever they are. Right now I'm doing a lot of humanitarian goals and having accomplished many of my own. And so I do try and create a sense of, you know, where the goal is important. But I don't think most goals are important enough in and of themselves to justify rudeness or impatience. And I am rude and impatient on a regular basis. And so it's the combination of an accurate criticism with the interruption of a worthwhile goal. But that's not enough to make me a rude person. it's more as I start to feel the chemical rush drain from my body, and I'm left alone with an aching body that's chronically stressed from undiagnosed, untreated PTSD. I've only learned that I had it in the last few years, which is a whole nother source of outrage. And, it's like, how can you do $100,000 of therapy with several supposedly good practitioners and not even get a diagnosis and actually make it worse? Because talk therapy can make aspects of trauma much worse because you're reliving it and you're stuck there, which is the whole thing your body's been trying to get out of for a whole lifetime. But that sense of, oh gosh, I'm losing my momentum, because I have a real sense of momentum that I've got to get up through the pain threshold, and I've got to get up to a certain speed. And then I've got to keep at that speed or higher, or I rapidly lose momentum, and then I have to go through the pain threshold again. And it is so miserable. And then there's the helpless wave that comes up, because when I realize I'm that fragile, which you can't help realizing when you realize a single little old lady in a car has just stopped flow, stopped the anesthetic, brought up pain that is far disproportionate, is out of proportion to the situation, and that I'm going to have to go through all that to get started again, and I've lost momentum, and I'm tired, and my body is tired. There's a rage, and there's a helplessness that's very understandable in the context of PTSD, which is so important, which is why it's so important that it is diagnosed and understood. It's not at all intelligent in the context of, for example, I get a lot of my jobs as a contractor done early. They're done early. But they're not done early because it's so important to get them done early. They're done early because I've got to stay in a state of flow, and I allow myself enough time that they generally get done early. So there is that cycle, and it has grief around it, because even an addict knows that, in this case, an adrenaline addict, even an addict knows that they're an addict on some level. They know it's not quite rational to be rude just because someone's holding you up for all of 2 minutes. 2 minutes is not a big deal. Losing flow and losing the chemical rush of flow is a big deal, because that 1 minute of pain takes you right down into the exhaustion and depression, etc., and then I got to get up through it again, and that is a big deal. That 2 minute wait just cost me 20% of my emotional, physical, mental reserves, and reminds me of how vulnerable and helpless I am in that terrain, which brings up a whole other spiral. It's like, what the fuck have I done spending $100,000 on therapy, and they haven't even, I'm dealing with this? This is the best they can do? It's like, what the fuck? This isn't supposed to be what life is about. Feeling helpless and depleted and stuff because you're held up in a traffic jam for 2 minutes? Something's off here. And I go rant about that with the therapist. I have to pay another couple $100, and they're like, yes, very interesting. And they do absolutely nothing about it. It just continues for years. Undiagnosed dis-ease, mental, emotional, or physical, is a killer. It kills the will. It kills the spirit. It's confusing. It's depressing. It's demoralizing. When you know what you're dealing with and why, you can get to it, be compassionate, be proactive. When you're just pouring time and money doing what the experts say and it's just not working, and they behave as if that's normal, it's maddening. And so I've gotten quite angry at some of my therapists, as the years went on in this, but also some question about that, the rudeness of it, and I don't like to be rude. So this is all kind of important part of the terrain of fear for me. In general, what I know about fear is it's important to list what is the fear, what's the worst that could happen, and what can I do to either avoid the terrain of the fear. Like if I look at it and say, I see this person is unkind and dishonest in this relationship, in this relationship, and in this relationship. They seem to be okay in that relationship, but those are not good odds. I don't believe that I'm somehow special. They're going to treat me the way they treat people in general, and I don't want to be a part of that. And so I'm just going to avoid that relationship, either very consciously by communicating, I don't think it's a good fit for me, and here's why, so let's have this boundary and let's just disengage here, or by very constructively going into it. I do this a lot with my partner, where I'm a pattern analyzer. That's partly how I manage fear and respond to it. And so if I can see her drifting in a direction, I watch trends. So for example, if her love for me is going down rather than up, the lingering gaze, the affection, the compliments, the presence, the smile on her face when I arrive, okay, love is going down. And if her apathy is going up or her laziness is going up, that's a trend. And I know that trends continue unless they are interrupted with consciousness and stuff is done. So I'll do that a lot. I do it with myself all the time. And I will do it with a partner, a girlfriend, a lover. I'll say, what's up? I'll take various 1 to 10 readings. I'll say, okay, you don't seem to be enjoying me as much as you did 2 days ago. Do you know why? What's going on? How do you feel? What's doing it? What would need to happen right now for you to have a peak experience with me? And in doing that, I'll interrupt the trend and take immediate action. And that's the positive side of being counterphobic from my perspective, because I'm very effective at detecting small movements that could turn into snowball effects if unchecked, if unexamined, and stepping in and doing something about them. And then they don't. And so often that's one of the reasons why a number of partners have told me that they have grown more with me than they have with anyone else, because I see the patterns in the relationship, I talk about them constantly, and I don't let go until either the relationship separates consciously and for good reasons, or the trend changes in a positive direction. And then I try and do more of that thing that is positive. Another thing that I do when I wake up in a panic or a dread is I move immediately into an exciting goal. I lay in bed until I have the energy reserves. And then I'm thinking, if I jumped out of bed and went swimming and diving in the beach, if I jumped out of bed and went and wrote this chapter, if I did this video blog, if I went out in the balcony and breathed deeply, if I did yoga, what would break the fear spell? And when I have a sense in my mind of what might do it, and I've got the energy reserves, which are not always there with chronic fatigue, which is in and of itself a source of anxiety, I get up and do it. And then that will often break the fear spell, one, or it will distract me from the fear spell. And I am doing a fair amount of distracting and stimulation flooding. So some of that is eating, some of that is sugar, some of that is smoking tobacco, very specifically for this. I don't smoke cigarettes, but I smoke cigar, and it does at times interrupt this. Some of that is masturbation, and it can take some other forms. It can take a meditative form, guided visualization. And then the biggest reason that I'm doing this video blogging in several hundred videos in the last couple of months in a wide range of areas is not only to create flow. I've got very strong flow. I'm looking at my own face in the camera. I'm tracking, I'm learning things as I'm talking. I'm trying to answer the question, what could be most helpful for other people? I'm particularly focused on filling voids in the social ecosphere. Like the things that I say in the way that I say them, I've never heard anyone else say. And that, to me, however politically incorrect, suggests that it potentially has more medicinal value than the normal thing, the normal self-help type thing, etc., etc. And I would say the other single most important thing that I highly recommend is flooding the inner child and adolescent with love. Going into those traumatic moments and filling it with love. And lastly, human beings are not capable in many situations in giving, they're not capable of giving the quality, intensity, and format of healing love around certain emotions, around certain wounds. And for that reason, I try and lift out and connect with consciousness that is not human, but is profoundly accepting, supportive, and loving. And giving the wound and the pain to that consciousness, which I believe consciousness is far more vast than we can possibly imagine, including any religion. So I don't try and name it as much as get a real visceral feeling emotionally and physically. And so that's what I do to heal fear. And the other thing I do is just acknowledge it, because there are a lot of very, very painful, shameful, miserable, lonely states and realities in this global ecosphere. And the ultimate human fear is the fear of loneliness. And there is a lot of loneliness on this planet. And many humans are not equipped to deal with it. So again, just understanding it, listing it, doing what I can do, and letting something bigger than me love me. Love the wound, love the fear, love the little boy, the little one inside me. Until I can breathe and feel like I can cope again and move into vision.